On a cold February morning in 1992, in a small Ohio town where neighbors knew each other's names and doors were left unlocked, a young woman named Jennifer Lynn Bailey walked out of her apartment to start her car before work. She was 23 years old, a kindergarten teacher with a warm smile and plans to marry in the spring. Her fiancé was waiting inside, drinking coffee and watching the morning news. Jennifer never came back through that door. Her body was found 3 hours later in a drainage ditch 7 miles outside of town, strangled with such force that the medical examiner would later testify the killer's hands had left bruises that went down to the bone. For 32 years, her case sat in a cardboard box in the basement of the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, gathering dust alongside dozens of other files that told stories no one had been able to finish. In December 2024, a detective named Sarah Kowalski pulled that box down from a shelf, opened it one more time, and found something everyone else had missed. What she discovered would lead to an arrest, a confession, and an answer to a question Jennifer's mother had been asking for 3 decades. Who took my daughter from me? Wooster, Ohio, sits in the heart of Wayne County, surrounded by rolling farmland and Amish communities where horse-drawn buggies still share the roads with pickup trucks. In 1992, it was a town of about 22,000 people, the kind of place where Friday night football games drew crowds, and the biggest employer was the College of Wooster, a private liberal arts school on the east side of town. Main Street had a diner called Betty's Kitchen, where the waitresses knew your order before you sat down, a hardware store that still kept a ledger instead of a computer, and a single traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 o'clock at night. It was not the kind of place where young women disappeared on Tuesday mornings in February. Jennifer Lynn Bailey had grown up in Wooster, the middle child of 3 daughters born to Robert and Catherine Bailey. Her father worked as a mechanic at the Ford dealership on the edge of town. Her mother was a nurse at Wooster Community Hospital, working the night shift so she could be home when the girls got off the school bus. Jennifer had been a quiet child, her teachers said, the kind of student who always had her homework done and volunteered to help clean up after art class. She played clarinet in the high school band. She dated a boy named Michael Preston all through her junior and senior years, and when they broke up the summer after graduation, she cried for 2 weeks straight, then never mentioned his name again. She went to Kent State University to study elementary education, living in the dorms and coming home on weekends to do her laundry and raid her mother's refrigerator. After graduation, she took a job teaching kindergarten at Edgewood Elementary, a squat brick building on the south side of Wooster, where the parking lot always smelled like the dairy farm next door. She was engaged to a man named Thomas Whitmore, a bank loan officer she had met at a wedding the previous summer. They were planning an outdoor ceremony in May, down by the lake at the county park. Jennifer had already picked out her dress, a simple white gown with lace sleeves that she kept hanging on the back of her bedroom door so she could look at it while she was getting ready in the mornings. Clear's Throat, February 11, 1992, was a Tuesday. The temperature hovered around 18 degrees when Jennifer woke up at 6:15 that morning in the apartment she shared with Thomas on Oak Street, a 2-bedroom unit above an insurance office. Thomas would later tell investigators that Jennifer had set her alarm for 6, but hit snooze twice before finally getting up. He remembered because he was already awake, couldn't sleep, had been lying there listening to the radiator clank and hiss. Jennifer took a shower. He heard the water running, heard her humming something he didn't recognize. She came out wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping onto the hardwood floor, leaving a trail of wet footprints from the bathroom to the bedroom. She dressed in the clothes she had laid out the night before, gray wool slacks, a burgundy sweater, thick socks because the school was always cold. She ate a bowl of cereal standing at the kitchen counter, Special K with skim milk, while Thomas made coffee in the percolator his mother had given them as an engagement gift. They talked about dinner plans. Jennifer wanted to try a new recipe she had torn out of a magazine, chicken with lemon and rosemary. Thomas said that sounded good. He would pick up a bottle of wine on his way home from work. At 7:20, Jennifer put on her coat, a navy blue parka with a torn pocket she kept meaning to sew but never got around to, and told Thomas she was going down to start the car. It was parked on the street, a 1987 Chevrolet Cavalier that her father had helped her buy when she got the teaching job. The engine was slow to turn over in cold weather, and Jennifer always went down 10 minutes early to let it warm up. Thomas stood at the kitchen window and watched her cross the street. He saw her unlock the driver's side door, saw her lean in to put the key in the ignition. Then his view was blocked by a moving truck that rumbled past, and when it cleared, Jennifer was gone. Thomas didn't think much of it at first. He assumed she had gotten in the car, closed the door. He poured himself another cup of coffee and turned on the television. The local news was showing footage of a barn fire in the next county over. Thomas watched for a few minutes, then looked at his watch. 7:35. Jennifer should have come back inside by now to get her school bag and her lunch, which was sitting on the counter in a brown paper sack. He walked to the window and looked down at the street. The Cavalier was still there, driver's door standing open, engine running. Jennifer was nowhere in sight. Thomas went downstairs. He called her name. The street was empty, the morning air so cold it hurt to breathe. He looked in the car. Her purse was on the passenger seat, her keys dangling from the ignition. The radio was playing softly, a song he would never be able to remember. He walked up the block, thinking maybe she had seen a neighbor, stopped to talk. He walked down the block in the other direction. Nothing. He went back upstairs and called the school. The secretary said Jennifer hadn't called in. Thomas hung up and dialed 911. The first patrol car arrived at 7:48. Officer David Marsh, a 28-year-old deputy who had been with the Wayne County Sheriff's Office for 6 years, took the report. He noted in his log that the fiancé seemed nervous, kept running his hands through his hair, couldn't stand still. The car door open, engine running, purse and keys inside. No sign of a struggle, no witnesses. No footprints in the thin dusting of snow on the sidewalk except Jennifer's, leading from the apartment building to the car, and Thomas's, coming down after her. Officer Marsh radioed for backup and began a grid search of the immediate area, walking up and down Oak Street, checking alleys and yards and the dumpsters behind the buildings. Other deputies arrived. They knocked on doors, woke people up, asked if anyone had seen or heard anything between 7:20 and 7:35. One woman, an elderly widow who lived across the street, said she had been at her kitchen table having her morning tea when she heard a car door slam, maybe 2 car doors. She couldn't be sure, but she didn't look out the window because car doors slammed all the time on Oak Street. It was a busy road. At 9:37, a farmer named Eugene Keller was driving his pickup truck on County Road 43, about 7 miles northeast of Wooster, when he saw what he thought was a bundle of clothes in the drainage ditch on the west side of the road. He slowed down, pulled over onto the shoulder, got out to look. It wasn't clothes. It was a woman, lying face down in the frozen mud, her burgundy sweater pulled up around her shoulders, her gray wool slacks torn at the knee. Eugene ran back to his truck and used his CB radio to call for help. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene at 9:52. They secured the area with yellow tape, called for the coroner, began photographing everything before they touched the body. The victim was identified by her driver's license, which was still in the back pocket of her slacks. Jennifer Lynn Bailey, 23 years old. Dobb, August 7, 1968. The preliminary examination showed signs of strangulation. There were deep bruises around her throat in the shape of fingers and thumbs. Her face was blue, eyes bloodshot, petechial hemorrhaging indicating asphyxiation. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, no sign of sexual assault. Her pockets were empty except for the license and a crumpled grocery receipt dated 3 days earlier. Clear as throat. The investigation began immediately with a scope and urgency that Wooster had never seen. Sheriff Dale Morrison, a barrel-chested man with 30 years on the force and a reputation for running a tight department, set up a command center at the station and brought in every available deputy. They divided the town into sectors and began canvassing door to door, asking residents if they had seen Jennifer that morning, if they had seen any unfamiliar vehicles, any strangers in the neighborhood. They put up flyers with Jennifer's photograph at the post office and the grocery store and the gas stations. They called in the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation to help process the crime scene on County Road 43. The scene yielded little physical evidence. There were tire tracks on the shoulder of the road, but the ground was frozen and the treads were indistinct. The medical examiner, Dr. William Hartley, estimated time of death between 7:30 and 8:30 in the morning based on body temperature and rigor mortis. Cause of death was manual strangulation. The bruising on her neck suggested the killer had extremely strong hands, had held on with enough force to crush her larynx and fracture the hyoid bone at the base of her tongue. Dr. Hartley noted in his report that this level of force suggested rage, personal animosity, someone who wanted to watch her die. Investigators focused initially on Thomas Whitmore. In cases like this, the spouse or partner is always the first suspect, statistically the most likely perpetrator. Thomas was brought in for questioning on the afternoon of February 11th. He sat in a small room with a tape recorder running and answered every question they asked him. He described the morning in detail, the alarm clock, the shower, the cereal, the conversation about dinner. He explained that he had been at the window when Jennifer went downstairs, had seen her cross the street and open the car door. He said he didn't follow her down right away because he had no reason to. It was a routine morning. Nothing seemed wrong. Deputies asked about their relationship. Thomas said it was good. They were happy, planning a wedding. No fights, no arguments, no jealousy or suspicions. They asked if Jennifer had any enemies, anyone who might want to hurt her. Thomas said no, everyone loved Jennifer. She was a kindergarten teacher, for God's sake. Who would want to hurt a kindergarten teacher? They asked where he worked, what his schedule was, whether he had any scratches or injuries. Thomas showed them his hands, clean, unmarked. He rolled up his sleeves. No bruises, no defensive wounds. They asked if they could search the apartment, and Thomas said yes, search whatever you want. The apartment was processed by forensic technicians who dusted for fingerprints and collected hair samples and looked for anything out of place. They found nothing. The bed was made. The dishes were washed. Jennifer's school bag was sitting by the door, her lunch still on the counter. Everything looked normal, orderly, the kind of place two young people lived who were saving money for a wedding and a house and a future together. Those who knew Jennifer said she had been excited about the wedding, talked about it constantly, showed everyone the bridal magazine she carried in her purse. Her mother, Catherine, told investigators that Jennifer had called her the night before she died to ask about flower arrangements, whether roses or lilies would be better for the centerpieces. Her father, Robert, said Jennifer had seemed happy, had no problems he knew of, no debts or secrets or complications. Her principal at Edgewood Elementary said Jennifer was one of the best teachers on staff. The kids adored her. Parents requested her class specifically. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Thomas Whitmore. There was something about him they couldn't quite pin down, a certain detachment in the way he talked about Jennifer, as if he were describing a stranger instead of the woman he was supposed to marry. One investigator noted that Thomas never cried during the interview, never broke down, maintained a calm, steady demeanor that seemed almost rehearsed. But detachment isn't evidence. A calm demeanor isn't proof. Thomas had an alibi for the critical time period. He was in the apartment, visible to neighbors, made phone calls from the landline that were documented on the phone company records. There was no way he could have killed Jennifer and dumped her body 7 miles away in the 15 minutes between when she went downstairs and when he called 911, clears throat, the community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers organized search parties to comb the fields and woods around County Road 43, looking for any evidence the deputies might have missed. The local newspaper, the Daily Record, ran Jennifer's photograph on the front page with the headline, "Teacher Slain, Killer at Large." Tips poured into the sheriff's office, dozens of them, people calling to report suspicious vehicles or strange men or neighbors who gave them bad feelings. Every tip was followed up, every lead investigated, and every single one went nowhere. Investigators began looking at Jennifer's past relationships. They tracked down Michael Preston, the high school boyfriend, and brought him in for questioning. Michael was living in Cleveland by then, working as an assistant manager at a retail store, engaged to someone else. He had an alibi for February 11th. He had been at work, clocked in at 7 in the morning, 45 minutes away from Wooster. Security cameras confirmed it. They looked at Jennifer's coworkers, her students' parents, anyone who might have had contact with her. They ran background checks and cross-referenced names with criminal databases. Nothing. The timeline became a central focus of the investigation. Jennifer had been alive at 7:20 when she left the apartment. Her body was found at 9:37. That gave the killer a window of just over 2 hours to abduct her, strangle her, and dump her body on County Road 43. The location was important. County Road 43 was a rural route, lightly traveled, surrounded by empty fields and patches of woods. It was not a random place. Whoever left Jennifer there knew the area, knew the road would be deserted at that time of morning, knew exactly where to pull over without being seen. Investigators measured the distance from Oak Street to County Road 43. 7.3 miles, about a 12-minute drive under normal conditions. That meant Jennifer had been taken somewhere, killed, and transported in a very short amount of time. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been caught by surprise, overpowered quickly, maybe even knew her attacker and didn't realize she was in danger until it was too late. The absence of sexual assault complicated the profile. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, wasn't a predator hunting for victims. This was personal, targeted someone who wanted Jennifer specifically. As weeks passed, the case began to slow down. The tips dried up. The search parties disbanded. The yellow tape came down from the drainage ditch on County Road 43, and the snow melted, and spring came, and Jennifer's funeral was held at the First Presbyterian Church on a rainy afternoon in March. The church was packed, standing room only, kindergartners holding drawings they had made for Miss Bailey, parents crying into tissues, Thomas sitting in the front row beside Jennifer's family, staring at the closed casket draped with white roses. For those who have ever lost someone to violence, who have sat in a church and listened to eulogies and tried to make sense of senselessness, you know the particular weight of that silence, the way grief sits in your chest like a stone. Jennifer's mother, Catherine, stood at the pulpit and read a statement she had written on a piece of notebook paper, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. She said Jennifer had been her middle child, the peacemaker, the one who broke up fights between her sisters and made sure everyone felt included. She said Jennifer had always wanted to be a teacher, had set up a classroom in the basement when she was 8 years old, and made her stuffed animals sit in rows while she taught them the alphabet. She said she didn't understand why this had happened, would never understand, but she believed whoever did this would be caught, would be punished, would have to answer for what they had taken from her family. Clear's throat, the case went cold. Not officially, because officially the Wayne County Sheriff's Office never closes a homicide case, but practically, functionally, in the way that matters when detectives move on to new cases and evidence boxes get filed away. And the public forgets because the public always forgets when there are no arrests, no trials, no resolution. Sheriff Morrison kept a copy of Jennifer's case file on his desk for years, took it home with him when he retired in 2003, passed it along to his successor with a note that said, "Never stop thinking about this one." Thomas Whitmore left Wooster 6 months after Jennifer's death. He broke the lease on the Oak Street apartment and moved to Columbus, took a job at a different bank, didn't tell anyone where he was going. Jennifer's family didn't blame him. Catherine said later that she understood, that staying in Wooster would have been impossible for Thomas, that everywhere he looked he would have seen reminders of Jennifer, ghosts on every corner. Jennifer's parents stayed. Robert kept working at the dealership. Catherine kept working at the hospital. They moved out of the house where Jennifer had grown up, couldn't bear to walk past her empty bedroom every morning, sold it to a young couple with a baby, and bought a smaller place on the other side of town. They went to grief counseling. They joined a support group for families of homicide victims. They lit a candle for Jennifer every year on her birthday and on the anniversary of her death. They waited for news that never came. Years passed. 1992 became 1995, became 2000, became 2010. The world changed. Technology advanced. DNA testing became standard. Cold case units were established in police departments across the country, dedicated teams of investigators who did nothing but review old files and retest old evidence with new methods. In 2018, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office assigned a detective named Sarah Kowalski to their cold case unit, a newly created position funded by a grant from the state. Sarah was 34 years old, a 12-year veteran of the department with a reputation for being thorough, meticulous, the kind of investigator who read every word of every report and noticed things other people missed. Sarah started with the oldest unsolved cases in the archive. She pulled files from the basement, spread them out on her desk, read through statements and reports and autopsy findings. Jennifer Bailey's case was one of the first she reviewed. Sarah read the initial incident report, the witness statements, the forensic analysis. She looked at the photographs from the scene on County Road 43, the pictures of Jennifer lying in the drainage ditch, the close-ups of the bruising on her neck. She read Thomas Whitmore's interview transcript 3 times, made notes in the margins, circled phrases that stood out. Clears throat, for those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have looked at a person you thought you knew and seen something that didn't fit. You understand the particular unease Sarah felt when she read through Thomas's statement. It wasn't anything specific, wasn't any single lie or contradiction. It was the accumulation of small things, details that were almost right but not quite, a story that made sense on the surface but felt rehearsed underneath. Thomas had described the morning with perfect clarity, remembered exact times and specific conversations, but couldn't remember what song was playing on the radio in Jennifer's car. He said he had been at the window when Jennifer went downstairs, but when asked what she was wearing, he said he couldn't recall, had to be reminded it was gray slacks and a burgundy sweater. Sarah pulled the phone records from February 11, 1992. Thomas had called 911 at 7:48. Before that, he had made 2 other calls. One to the school at 7:37, asking if Jennifer had arrived. One to his own workplace at 7:42, leaving a message that he would be late. Sarah noted the timing. If Thomas had gone downstairs at 7:35 and found Jennifer's car running with the door open, why had he waited 2 minutes to call the school? What had he been doing in those 2 minutes? She pulled Thomas's background. No criminal record, no history of violence or domestic disturbances. He had been 26 years old in 1992, working at First National Bank as a junior loan officer. His personnel file showed he had been a good employee, punctual, professional, well-liked by coworkers. He had left the bank in August 1992 when he moved to Columbus. Sarah tracked him forward through time, found he had married someone else in 1997, divorced in 2004, remarried in 2008. He was living in Cincinnati now, working as a senior vice president at a regional bank, had 2 children from his second marriage. Sarah made a note to interview Thomas again, but first she wanted to re-examine the physical evidence. The original forensic analysis had been limited by the technology of the time. DNA testing in 1992 was expensive and time-consuming, required large samples, and wasn't always reliable. But in 2018, DNA analysis had advanced dramatically. Sarah contacted the evidence locker and requested everything collected from the scene on County Road 43. The evidence had been stored in a climate-controlled facility, logged and preserved according to protocol. Sarah went through it methodically. There were swabs taken from Jennifer's neck, from under her fingernails, from her clothing. There were fiber samples, soil samples, the grocery receipt from her pocket. Sarah sent everything to the state forensic lab with a request for DNA analysis using the latest techniques. She didn't expect much. The case was 30 years old. The evidence had been handled by multiple people, contaminated by time and exposure. But Sarah had learned early in her career that you don't find answers by assuming you won't find answers. You find answers by looking. Clear as throat. The lab results came back in November 2024. Most of the samples yielded nothing usable, degraded DNA that was too fragmented to generate a profile. But one sample, a swab taken from the collar of Jennifer's sweater, contained intact male DNA that did not match Jennifer or any of the investigators who had handled the evidence. The lab ran the profile through CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI. No match. The DNA belonged to someone who had never been arrested, never had their DNA entered into the system. Sarah sat at her desk and stared at the report. Unknown male DNA on Jennifer's collar. That meant someone had touched her, grabbed her, held her by the sweater while they strangled her. The DNA was there, preserved for 32 years, waiting for someone to find it. But without a match in the database, it was just a sequence of letters and numbers, meaningless without a name to attach to it. Sarah went back to the original case file. She made a list of every person who had been interviewed, every name that appeared in the reports. She cross-referenced the list with current addresses and contact information. Most of the witnesses from 1992 were still alive, still living in Ohio, still reachable. Sarah began making phone calls, re-interviewing people, asking if they remembered anything else, any detail they might have forgotten to mention 30 years ago. One of the people she called was Thomas Whitmore. Sarah reached him at his office in Cincinnati on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. She identified herself, explained she was reviewing Jennifer's case, asked if he would be willing to answer some follow-up questions. Thomas said yes, of course, anything he could do to help. His voice on the phone was calm, professional, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years working in banking, who knew how to present himself, how to sound cooperative and concerned. Sarah asked Thomas to describe the morning of February 11th, 1992. Thomas gave the same account he had given the deputies 32 years earlier, almost word for word. The alarm clock at 6:15, the shower, the cereal, the conversation about dinner. Sarah listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. She asked about his relationship with Jennifer, whether they had been happy, whether there had been any problems. Thomas said no, everything had been fine, they were planning a wedding, looking forward to the future. Sarah asked if Thomas would be willing to provide a DNA sample for exclusionary purposes, just to rule him out as a source of contamination on the evidence. Thomas hesitated. Sarah heard the silence on the other end of the line, heard him breathing, heard the sound of a door closing in the background. Thomas asked why they needed his DNA. Sarah said it was standard procedure. They were retesting all the evidence with new technology, needed to account for everyone who had been at the scene or handled Jennifer's belongings. Thomas said he would have to think about it, would need to talk to his lawyer. That was on December 3rd, 2024. On December 5th, Sarah received a call from an attorney representing Thomas Whitmore, informing her that his client was declining to provide a DNA sample without a court order. Sarah thanked the attorney and hung up. She immediately drafted an affidavit requesting a search warrant for Thomas Whitmore's DNA. outlining the unknown male DNA found on Jennifer's collar, the inconsistencies in Thomas's original statement, his refusal to cooperate with the new investigation. A judge reviewed the affidavit and signed the warrant on December 9th. Clears throat on December 10th, 2024. Sarah Kowalski and two other detectives drove to Cincinnati and executed the search warrant at Thomas Whitmore's office. Thomas was sitting at his desk, on the phone with a client when they walked in. Sarah identified herself, showed him the warrant, asked him to open his mouth so she could swab the inside of his cheek. Thomas complied without speaking. His hands were shaking. The swab took less than 30 seconds. Sarah sealed it in an evidence bag, thanked Thomas for his cooperation, and left. The sample was sent to the state forensic lab with a priority request. The lab fast-tracked the analysis, and on December 18th, the results came back. The DNA from Thomas Whitmore was a match to the unknown male DNA found on Jennifer Bailey's sweater collar. A match with a probability of 1 in 400 billion, meaning it was more likely that Thomas was the source than that anyone else in the world was the source. Sarah called the prosecutor's office. She met with Assistant District Attorney Michael Brennan, laid out the evidence, showed him the DNA match, the inconsistencies in Thomas's original statement, his refusal to cooperate voluntarily. Brennan reviewed everything and agreed there was probable cause for an arrest. On December 20th, 2024, a warrant was issued for Thomas Whitmore's arrest on charges of aggravated murder in the death of Jennifer Lynn Bailey. Thomas was arrested at his home in Cincinnati on the morning of December 21st. Deputies knocked on his door at 6 o'clock, early enough that the street was still dark and most of his neighbors were asleep. Thomas answered in his bathrobe, a cup of coffee in his hand. The deputies read him his rights, placed him in handcuffs, walked him out to a patrol car while his wife and children watched from the doorway. The arrest was captured on body camera footage, later played in court, showing Thomas silent, stone-faced, staring straight ahead as the car pulled away from the curb. The news spread quickly. The Daily Record ran a front-page story with a photograph of Thomas's mugshot and a headline that read, "Arrest made in 1992 Bailey murder." The local television stations sent reporters to stand outside the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, broadcasting live updates every hour. Social media lit up with speculation and outrage and satisfaction, depending on who you asked and what they remembered about the case. Those who had known Thomas in 1992 were divided. Some said they had always suspected him, had never believed his story, thought there was something cold about the way he acted after Jennifer's death. Others said they were shocked, couldn't believe it, remembered Thomas as a kind, quiet man who had been devastated by losing his fiancé. Jennifer's mother, Catherine, now 78 years old and living in a retirement community outside of Wooster, told reporters she felt relief, finally, after 32 years, that someone was being held accountable. Clears throat, Thomas Whitmore was extradited to Wayne County and held without bond pending trial. His attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Richard Caldwell, filed a motion to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing that the search warrant had been overly broad and the seizure of Thomas's DNA had violated his Fourth Amendment rights. The motion was denied. Caldwell then argued that the DNA on Jennifer's collar could have been transferred innocently, that Thomas and Jennifer had lived together, shared clothing and space, that his DNA being present on her sweater proved nothing about who killed her. The prosecutor's office prepared for trial. Assistant District Attorney Brennan reviewed the evidence with Sarah Kowalski and a team of forensic experts. They built a timeline showing that Thomas had the means, motive, and opportunity. The means, his physical strength, his access to Jennifer. The motive, unclear, but statistically, most women who are murdered are killed by intimate partners. The opportunity, the window between 7:20 and 7:35 on the morning of February 11, 1992, when Jennifer disappeared from in front of their apartment building. The forensic evidence told a story. The DNA on Jennifer's collar had been deposited through direct contact, not secondary transfer. The pattern of the bruising on Jennifer's neck matched the span of Thomas's hands, measured during the booking process and compared to the autopsy photographs. The location where Jennifer's body was found, County Road 43, was along a route Thomas had driven regularly when he worked at the bank, a shortcut he took to avoid traffic on the main roads. Investigators re-interviewed the elderly neighbor who had heard car doors slamming on the morning Jennifer disappeared. Shown a photograph of Thomas's vehicle from 1992, a dark blue Ford Taurus. The woman said yes, that could have been what she heard. 2 doors on the same car, driver's side and passenger side, someone getting out and then getting back in. The timing fit. Thomas could have followed Jennifer down to the street, approached her while she was starting the car, forced her into his own vehicle, driven her to County Road 43, and returned to the apartment within the 15-minute window. But why? That was the question everyone asked, the question that had no clear answer. Thomas and Jennifer had been engaged, planning a wedding, by all accounts happy together. Thomas had no history of violence, no prior arrests, no documented incidents of abuse or controlling behavior. The prosecutor's theory was that something had happened that morning, some argument or revelation that had triggered a rage in Thomas, something that made him snap and do something irreversible. But without a confession, without Thomas explaining what had happened and why, it remained speculation. Clear's throat. On March 4, 2025, Thomas Whitmore's trial began in Wayne County Common Pleas Court. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, Jennifer's family sitting in the front row on the prosecution's side. Thomas sat at the defense table in a gray suit, his expression neutral, his hands folded in his lap. He looked older than his 59 years, gray-haired and thin, a man who had lived 3 decades with a secret that was finally catching up to him. The prosecution called Sarah Kowalski as their first witness. She testified about reopening the case, about finding the DNA evidence, about tracking down Thomas and executing the search warrant. She described the moment the lab results came back, the confirmation that the DNA on Jennifer's collar belonged to Thomas. She showed the jury photographs from the crime scene, photographs of Jennifer lying in the drainage ditch, photographs of the bruises on her neck. The defense cross-examined Sarah, trying to poke holes in the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination, suggesting innocent transfer. Sarah remained calm, methodical, walked the jury through the chain of custody, explained how the evidence had been stored and tested and verified. She said there was no reasonable way Thomas's DNA could have been on Jennifer's collar unless he had been there when she died, unless he had grabbed her and held her and strangled her. The medical examiner, Dr. William Hartley, now retired but called back to testify, described the autopsy findings. He showed the jury diagrams of the human neck, explained how manual strangulation works, how long it takes, how much force is required. He said Jennifer would have been conscious for at least 30 seconds, maybe a full minute, would have known she was dying, would have struggled and fought but couldn't break free. He measured the bruises on the autopsy photographs and compared them to the size of Thomas's hands. They matched. The defense called character witnesses, people who had known Thomas over the years, who testified that he was a good man, a good father, a good employee. They called experts who disputed the DNA findings, who said there was no way to know for certain when or how the DNA had been deposited. They argued that the prosecution's case was circumstantial, built on coincidence and suspicion rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. On March 18th, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On March 20th, they returned a verdict, guilty of aggravated murder. Thomas Whitmore sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face blank, his hands still folded in his lap. Jennifer's mother, Catherine, sobbed into her daughter's shoulder. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for April 15th. At sentencing, The judge allowed victim impact statements. Catherine Bailey stood at the podium, her voice steady now, and spoke directly to Thomas. She said, "You took my daughter from me. You took her life, her future, everything she could have been. You let me spend 32 years wondering who did this, let me die a little bit every day not knowing. And all this time it was you. You were there, pretending to grieve, pretending to care. I hope you spend the rest of your life thinking about what you did. I hope it haunts you the way it has haunted me." The judge sentenced Thomas Whitmore to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thomas was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head down, saying nothing. He was transported to the Ohio State Penitentiary, where he remains today, an inmate in his 60s serving a sentence that will end only when he dies. Clear's throat, the case of Jennifer Lynn Bailey is closed now, officially solved, a name removed from the list of Ohio's unsolved homicides. But closure is a word that means different things to different people. For Catherine Bailey, it means knowing who killed her daughter, means seeing justice delivered even if it came 3 decades too late. For Sarah Kowalski, it means vindication, proof that cold cases can be solved if someone is willing to look hard enough and long enough. For the community of Wooster, it means a reminder that violence can hide in plain sight, that the person sitting next to you at church or standing in line at the grocery store might be carrying secrets that would destroy you if you knew them.